One of the biggest complaints I've heard in regards to tropes versus women in video games is how unfair people are to Anita Sarkeesian. How her critics misrepresent her arguments and use anything they can to invalidate or discredit her. I've been accused of such things myself, so that's where I want to start out, is how I decided to approach tropes versus women in video games. I didn't learn about Anita Sarkeesian until a bit after Gamergate had already started. When I first found out about her videos, I watched them, but had no interest in responding at the time. However, I did feel like learning more about Anita, so I went through some of her older videos. I didn't watch all of them, just a few, but I had at least watched all episodes of Tropes vs. Women in Video Games. I checked out this one, Feminism in Focus. There was one thing that caught my attention in this.
There's often a lot of hostility towards watching TV, like it's this big, bad, horrible thing that's gonna warp our brains, but I don't think that's true.
With this particular clip, it didn't line up with something I remembered seeing in Women's Background Decoration Part 1.
Compounding the problem is the widespread belief that, despite all the evidence, exposure to media has no real-world impact. There's often a lot of hostility towards watching TV, like it's this big, bad, horrible thing that's gonna warp our brains, but I don't think that's true.
My original interpretation of that was back in 2011, she was saying media wasn't that harmful, whereas in 2014, she was talking about how harmful games are. Part of what led me to that conclusion was in Damsel in Distress Part 2, she said what game developers do with certain gameplay mechanics is dangerously irresponsible.
Given the reality of that larger cultural context, it should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women in order to save them.
In retrospect, I realized what Anita meant. Back in 2011, she wasn't saying media doesn't affect us, she was talking about how people overreact to media. However, going back to video games, Anita's claims on how dangerous some of these gameplay mechanics are is not supported by evidence, which is another problem I have with Anita Sarkeesian's videos, the lack of evidence to support her claims. So whereas in 2011 she was criticizing people who overreact to media, with tropes versus women in video games, she has become one of the people that overreacts to media.
There's often a lot of hostility towards watching TV, like it's this big, bad, horrible thing that's gonna warp our brains, but I don't think that's true. It should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women in order to save them.
So even if I had a different interpretation of her words when I started making video responses, I still would have made them. I would have structured some of my earlier arguments differently, but even at that, I still stand by a lot of the criticism I've made. Now getting back on topic, I decided to make video responses. So the questions I had when I first started was, do I bring anything new to the table? I didn't want to just recycle what everyone else said. Can I do it better than others? I never liked the approach some people use. Looking at the harassment narrative, I had to figure out a way around it while still being a legitimate critic. I viewed this as not just an issue of disagreement, but also a game of strategy. I think Anita and Macintosh are very strategic in how they've pulled everything off. When I studied martial arts, 2 lessons my instructor taught me was defanging the snake and finding an equalizer. Defanging the snake means if your opponent has a weapon, try to disarm them. Anita's greatest weapon is the harassment narrative. Anyone who falls victim to it is pretty much defeated by it, because now they are a harasser instead of just a critic. I don't yell in my videos or say sexist things. I generally don't use unnecessary insults, and at least for the first few months I was extremely respectful. I generally don't go out of my way to contact Anita or her supporters. I don't harass them into accepting my criticism. I don't try to ram it down their throat. I completely disarmed the ability of Anita and her supporters to cry harassment against me. Finding an equalizer means if your opponent has a weapon, can you grab anything at your disposal to even up the odds? Looking at Anita's work, she takes a trope, like the damsel in distress, and she attacks it from every angle possible. She misrepresents games and leaves out key details to frame the trope however she wants. She does minimal research to make her arguments. Her claims are bigger in scale than her evidence. She also likes to craft these little sets of rules that everyone else is supposed to follow that she herself does not follow. So I decided that if that's how Anita wants to play, I'll just play her at her own game. I attack her work from every angle possible. This is why when I review her Tropes videos, I address everything she says point by point. Where she misrepresents things, I try to add context. I try to include details she leaves out. To demonstrate how weak her research is, I do my own research to make my point. I demonstrate that she is not proving these massive claims that she makes. The burden of proof is on her at the time she makes the claim. I also find flaws in her little sets of rules, such as when she steps outside of them. Just one example of this is how Anita talks about Princess Peach.
She's been replaced with another Toad instead, as to allow Nintendo to force her back into the damsel role again and again.
Most people would think, what about all the games where Peach is playable? Anita has an answer for that.
Peach does of course appear in many spin-offs such as the Mario Party, Mario Sports, and Mario Kart series, as well as the Super Smash Bros. Nintendo Universe crossover fighting games. However, all of these spin-offs fall well outside of the core Super Mario series of platformers.
I've contested for some time that the core series nonsense is her own rule. No one said other games don't count except Anita, and I don't think it's fair to let her dictate rules like that if we want to be fair to Nintendo. But let's just assume I decide to play by Anita's rules and exclude any spin-offs of the Mario franchise. Anita, however, decides she wants to talk about Super Princess Peach.
She is the star of only one adventure, and we'll get to that a little later.
And she does talk about that game in Damsel in Distress Part 3. This is just one example of Anita not following her own rules. Anita sets rules like this all throughout her entire series of videos, where she dances in and out of what does and doesn't count. So now that I have a game plan, I decided to start making video responses. Just so many of you understand, a lot of thought goes into my videos. Am I misrepresenting her arguments? Can I get away with this? What are potential counter-arguments to mine? What arguments in her videos do I have to account for? I also try to find ways to use her own arguments against her. I try to point out many of the ridiculous things she says and examples she uses. I have to carefully consider and craft a lot of what I'm saying. They spend months making these master-level theses for each video, so it's not just as simple as pumping out video responses. While Anita Sarkeesian tries to make rock-solid arguments that are bulletproof, I try to do the same with my responses. I know my work isn't perfect, but there was a lot of valid criticism of Anita's videos. I remember my first interaction with a Sarkeesian supporter. It was after being featured in Bloomberg. The gaming industry's greatest adversary is just getting started. If I remember right, there was a follow-up to this addressing some comments. I responded to this on Twitter with something along the lines of, they focused on her harassment and dismissed any criticism of her work. One of her supporters responded with, why do I follow Anita if I hate her? I explained I don't hate her, I follow her for updates. Then they started bringing up things like 4chan and Reddit and gaming culture. I tried explaining that wasn't all of gaming culture, but after several exchanges I pointed out I was talking about her work, and they wanted to make it about gaming culture. After that, they just stopped responding to me. I left that exchange feeling a lot of people who support Anita don't care about her work, just her harassment. I've also had a few exchanges with some of her other supporters over the last year and a half, and to put it simply, they treat me like I'm harassing Anita. But I've also had a few discussions with some of them about her work. I can't find every comment I've had, as this is my third YouTube channel, but I've been told I suck, I need to stop making videos, shut up, I'm part of the problem, I'm being dishonest, etc, etc. I've never dealt with criticism in the volumes that Anita has, but I have put up with it. I think my biggest problem dealing with them is that they don't really want to concede anything. The most I'll see is, they don't agree with Anita on everything, but they never go into specifics. It's like, where do you disagree with her? Where is she wrong? Just to show you an example of me criticizing myself, I'll point to a factual inaccuracy in my work.
The gender role reversal is so unusual that it borders on the absurd.
In Kill Bill, Uma Thurman's fiance is murdered at her wedding, and she seeks revenge by killing all the other assassins and Bill himself. After making that video, I realized it wasn't the wedding, it was the wedding rehearsal. I just corrected a factual inaccuracy in my own work. Now for misrepresentation.
this is still a problem, while this is not. Again, because one reinforces pre-existing stereotypes about women, while the other does not reinforce any pre-existing stereotypes about men.
I guess Anita missed Magic Mike while she was working hard on her videos, as that look is a stereotype of male strippers. It's actually not an issue of how the male damsel looks, it's about the stereotype of women being damseled more often than men, and how having damseled men doesn't solve the problem. Now, while I would still disagree with a lot of Anita's points, I can say in that particular instance I was wrong. I misrepresented what she said. When will Anita do this? When will she acknowledge factual inaccuracies and misrepresentations? I could debate an Anita supporter and concede everything they say, but what about Anita? Even if I could get a Sarkeesian supporter to be critical of Anita's work, when will Anita accept it? She won't. I've asked her supporters to show me where she's ever admitted when she's wrong. To my knowledge, she doesn't. If you want a world where Anita never admits she's wrong, you'll always have people criticizing. That is the nature of people who push work like Anita's. As long as it has problems, people will always call her out. So anyways, I spent several months making videos about Anita. After I reviewed Damsel in Distress Part 3, I started pondering what I'd do after I was done. I estimated I'd be done with women as background decoration by my 20th video on her work, and then I'd probably move on. Then she dropped the Kickstarter update number 27, how our Tropes vs. Women project had expanded and transformed. Up until this point, I had reviewed Damsel in Distress Part 1 through 3, but didn't get around to Ms. Male character or women as background decoration. As I read through the update, I came to this section, the current scope of the project. Instead of examining a handful of examples for each trope, we sift through hundreds of games across a variety of genres and platforms. For example, we reference 182 games in our coverage of the Damsel in Distress trope alone. We have also cataloged and documented over 548 examples of the Damsel in Distress throughout the history of video games. As I was reading this, I couldn't help but remember in my first review of Damsel in Distress, I pointed out that this constitutes less than 1% of every game ever made, and I hammered that point in several of my other videos. Our desire to be more specific in the analysis meant that we made connections to other related tropes, including some that we identified and named ourselves. For example, in the Damsel in Distress videos, we also discussed new tropes such as the helpful damsel, the damsel in the refrigerator, the disposable damsel, and the euthanized damsel. With all that and more, it's easy to see how we ended up with an hour-long multi-part series just on this one topic alone. Again, as I was reading this, I couldn't help but remember in my second review of Damsel in Distress, I had pointed out that in Part 1, Anita said the damsel is often combined with other separate tropes, just to turn around in Part 2 and emphasize how horrible the damsel in distress is when they combine it with other separate tropes.
Let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the designated victim, the heroic rescue, and the smooch of victory. However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the damsel in distress trope itself. So we've seen developers try to spice up the damsel in distress cliché by combining it with other tropes that involve victimized women. I've identified a few of the most common of these trope cocktails, which join together multiple regressive or negative representations of women, including the disposable woman, the mercy killing, and the woman in the refrigerator. However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the damsel in distress trope itself.
In the update, she didn't have much to say about Ms. Male character or women as background decoration, which are the videos I hadn't reviewed yet. I was wondering why she had so much to say about the damsel in distress videos when they were old news and people had already said a lot about them. I can't recall anyone hammering her numbers and trope combinations like I did, especially the trope combinations. As I was reading this update, it was like reading a response to my criticism. I felt like I played by Anita Sarkeesian's rules and beat her arguments fair and square. I honestly don't know if this was aimed at me or not, but the timing of the update and what was said in it was rather convenient. All I could think was how dishonest this was. That was the frame of mind I was in, so it fired me up and I started pumping out videos. For some time, there were a few channels I followed on both sides of the discussion, Zenistrad's being one of them. One day he posted this, how to become popular on YouTube.
Anita Sarkeesian sucks!
I thought it was funny when I first watched it. I've never been a fan of people whose biggest criticism is, she sucks. I've also had several of my supporters compliment me on my approach over the last year and a half, that I didn't take the road of the angry male gamer. Then I read the comment section in Zenistrad's video. Mr. Male Trope's doing it wrong then. That put a smile on my face, because that is part of why I use the approach I do, so people can't use the harassment narrative against me. What bothered me was the response by Zenistrad. I don't know, Soggy of a Patreon's been promoting his work lately. How is Sargon of Akkad promoting my videos a legitimate criticism? That insinuates that who promotes your work is a valid criticism. Couldn't I say the same about Anita? Couldn't I argue that anything she promotes is problematic just because she promoted it? Given various other videos I've seen of Zenistrad's, how he tried dealing with Sargon of Akkad in that time frame last year, and the demeanor of his comment about me, I had no real interest in challenging him at that time. So let's talk about another Sarkeesian supporter, Ian Danskin of Innuendo Studios. He had a series of videos about Angry Jack. He talked about Anita Sarkeesian and Gamergate. I avoided responding to those videos for a multitude of reasons, the main ones being I am not Angry Jack and I'm not part of Gamergate. One I did take an interest in was a single study in Germany, video games and cultivation theory.
It's possible by now you've heard of a study making the rounds that claims to have found no connection between video games and sexist attitudes. Perhaps you saw a link attached to a sentence like, John McIntosh's entire body of work is based on a lie?
Without covering the entire video, he basically says people use this one study to try and discredit Jonathan McIntosh's entire body of work, and that a lot of people don't understand cultivation theory, and in turn don't understand Anita Sarkeesian and her arguments. Now I could respond with, how do I interpret it when one of Anita's supporters says this about my entire body of work? This doesn't even constitute an argument. It's just, I don't like Sargon.
And let's please keep in mind that gamers ate this shit up when Jane McGonigal said that video games could make you a better person. They only started crying foul when feminist critics argued, well, if they can make us better, they are at least capable of making some of us worse. Then everyone went apeshit and said, let's just forget the whole thing then. And before anyone says, that's not fair, Jane McGonigal talks about mechanics while Anita Sarkeesian talks about narrative. No. They both talk about both, the two are not easily separable. Do your research.
Now let's just assume for a second that most people don't understand what Anita is getting at. I still have problems with some of her unsubstantiated claims.
It should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women in order to save them.
Dangerously irresponsible. Based on what evidence?
It's hard to get anywhere in this conversation because people want to boil it down to, look, are you saying games are good for you or games are bad for you? Games are neither. They're games. They're culture.
It's hard to get anywhere in this conversation because of that. How do you have a conversation with Anita and Jonathan when I think they'd rather use underhanded tactics to deal with criticism? What about when you read this in the comment section of one of Anita's supporters? Speaking of comment sections, guess who I found in yours? None other than Zenistrad. You're the YouTuber that we've desperately needed since Logic Bomb left. I was dismissed for a bogus reason, but Innuendo Studios is praised by the same guy. He mentioned Logic Bomb, so let's go to one of his videos, Thunderfoot Busted.
Let's start this off by looking at the description of your video where you claim to have busted Anita Sarkeesian. You then attempt to refute Anita by focusing on her use of a 35-second clip from Hitman Absolution, which constitutes only 2% of her video and less than 0.5% of the over 2 hours of Tropes vs. Women in Video Games series that she'd released up to that point.
When I first watched this video in 2014, I had not watched all of Thunderfoot's Anita videos, just a few. Logic Bomb was throwing out a bunch of numbers and statistics, so I went through Thunderfoot's channel and found a lot of videos on Anita. His first video was published on March 14, 2013, about a week after Anita released her first video. He's been responding to her since she started releasing videos.
Tip for skeptics. Blatant hypocrisy is often a sign that logical fallacies are not far behind.
Logic Bomb's response dismisses the fact Thunderfoot had already said a lot about tropes versus women in video games. He wasn't trying to dismiss her just because of Hitman, it was part of an ongoing series. I was thinking that Logic Bomb was being the hypocrite.
But are you trying to refute her arguments? No. You were trying to accuse her of being a dishonest liar.
Her level of dishonesty beggars belief. It really does just beggar belief. Jesus Christ, woman, you are a liar without shame.
Ad hominem. Attacking the arguer instead of the argument. Poisoning the well. A type of ad hominem where adverse information about a target is presented with the intention of discrediting everything that the target person says.
Logic Bomb was poisoning the well against Thunderfoot. I'm not going to say that I don't have any criticism of Thunderfoot, but Logic Bomb was off to a bad start in his first video, where he was committing the logical fallacies he was accusing others of. So let's continue to Jim Sterling, who started making videos before Anita released hers.
You know, I'm all for getting your point across in a childish way if that's what it takes. I'm all for righteous indignation, and if there's a just cause, I'll be grabbing a pitchfork and a torch alongside y'all. However, if your plan to silence an internet personality is to attack her with disproportionate amounts of harassment and abuse in such a way that ensures she becomes one of the biggest stories of the year, well, I mean, you know how dumb that is, right?
I actually agreed with a lot of what Jim said in this video, but this one really hit home with me.
Hell, as far as Anita goes, there are some solid criticisms you can level at her work. I'm not 100% on her side, you know. She's not perfect by a long shot, and her video series seems already to be a little off base with some of the examples she's named as targets.
For some of us, that's all we want. People who aren't afraid to stand up and say, here is where I disagree with Anita. However...
But we can't talk about that anymore, because the debate's not about whether she's right or wrong. The debate was invalidated when people decided to try and ruin her life en masse. The chance to debate her on merit was lost once people started threatening to rape her. Now it's hard to debate her points without people thinking you hate her because she's a woman, and that's a direct result of her being hated by so many for being a woman.
I tried to stay as far away from the harassment narrative as I could and steer the debate toward her work. You make it sound like she could have been debated on merit, but I don't think that's what she wants. I did find another clip of Jim Sterling.
Anita Sarkeesian is not Magneto. And when people say she needs to be stopped, I think that's what people say about Magneto. She's not that! She doesn't have a brother, well, a sisterhood of evil mutants. She ain't gonna take your games away.
Anita is not Magneto and doesn't want to take our games away. I guess my biggest gripe is Jim comes across as someone who will admit her work has issues, but would never really step forward and explain why. That's often the most I'll get out of her supporters is, well, I don't agree with everything she says. How about movie Bob Chipman?
Suffice it to say, having seen her earlier videos on similar subject, I imagine I'll find plenty to disagree with, but it's a project deserving of support, and certainly not deserving of all this preemptive backlash.
Bob Chipman, much like Jim Sterling, said before she released any videos that he'd probably have some criticism of it. This is what he said in his review of Damsel in Distress Part 1.
Oh, I don't mean the episode. The episode is actually pretty damn good. Insightful, well-researched, exceptionally well-produced with a solid execution. If I had one major criticism to offer, it's that the overall presentation is a little dry, but I get more or less why that is. This isn't a YouTube rant or a typical gamer show, it's an academic presentation. Something designed more ideally for a classroom or seminar setting that's looking to educate the viewer and or clarify the position of the speaker than to entertain or sneak relevant commentary in under the guise of humor.
Bob thought it was well researched. Some of my criticisms of tropes versus women in video games is the lack of research to substantiate their claims, the misrepresentations of games, as well as the problems with some of her arguments. Watching Movie Bob's review as I write this script, I disagree with a lot of what Movie Bob says. Not so much that I disagree with everything he says, so much as how he words his arguments in such a way that Anita's videos aren't as problematic as they really are. How about Jamin Warren from PBS Game Show?
So do video games need Anita Sarkeesian's feminism? Yeah.
Jamin doesn't hide the fact he likes to talk about video game feminism. He's obviously supportive of Anita. So I could tell Jamin, Anita stole Let's Play footage without giving credit. Do video games need that?
Yeah.
She misrepresents games. Do video games need that?
Yeah.
She won't admit when she's wrong, even if it can be proven. Do video games need that?
Yeah.
I know this sounds a bit silly, but this is what it's like dealing with a hardcore Sarkeesian supporter. You can't talk sense into them. They will often try to educate you on how important she is while dismissing everything you say. How about Jonathan Mann?
We are not Jack Thompson. We love video games. We want them to be better. We don't want them to stay the same.
That sounds nice at face value. Since I was just speaking about Jamin Warren, if we go back in time a few years to 2011, Controlled Invasion, a game design manifesto. Jamin Warren appears in this video.
I believe the gameplay can change real-world behavior. What games do really well is bring a lot of different parts, certainly through creating games also. Games bring a lot of different things together, bring a lot of different types of reasoning into a single space.
This video was played during Ludic Salon. Let's see how this lines up with Jonathan Mann's song.
We're not Jack Thompson. We don't want anything banned.
I don't like, I just say what I don't like. I don't like the games industry.
Quite the opposite. We want the world of games to expand.
What is a casual game? I mean, it's just fun. And for me, it's not enough.
You're living in a terror dream. I think you're confused. Maybe it's our arguments or the words we use.
Game designers have a moral obligation in the sense that they're creating addictive media. They're creating essentially chemically habit-forming media.
You don't like gone home. You're a traditionalist, but Call of Duty 35 could coexist with Depression Quest.
I mean, I'm far too old to do this because, you know, no one's going to be interested in what I've got to say. But if you've got people who are young enough and subversive enough to make it really cool to attack this bloated media, then it's something that we could really use, I think.
We're not Jack Thompson. We don't want anything banned.
I think that it is only a matter of time before some politician somewhere basically looks at a lot of these social games and says, these are certain types, these encourage certain types of human behavior and they need to be regulated.
To me, when I hear limits, I start thinking legislation, I start thinking constraints.
Quite the opposite. We want the world of games to expand.
And it's funny because there's no like Hippocratic oath that game designers have to, and maybe that's what this is all about. There's in other fields and other disciplines, there are a set of standards that you sort of have to abide by, or expectations that you have that you will not use your powers for evil.
These people don't convey the message you preach about tolerance. A lot of that Ludic Salon and Game Design Manifesto goes completely against what Sarkeesian supporters say they want. While I have these on screen, according to Twitter, he's the founder and artist director of Amaze. On the Amaze Twitter account, I found this tweet. We are Boing Boing, Lee Alexander and the Raimi. Most people would recognize Lee, and some would recognize Raimi. Connecting dots doesn't necessarily prove anything, but I've been surprised how the same names always come up when I research these people. Anytime I find someone I'd never heard of, I always find the same names when I dig around. So let's go to another person who seems to like making videos defending Anita's style ideology. Dan Olson. This is from the Thermian Argument.
Today, we're going to talk about boundaries. Specifically, we're going to be talking about diegetic justification for creepy garbage and how terrible and flawed it is as an argument. So there's a bad habit that people have gotten into. It's nothing new, but it's becoming more and more common, and it goes like this.
Folding Ideas gives a short critique of what I assume is a fictional anime, then shows a standard response you might see from someone who criticizes him.
Dan Olsen is wrong to complain. If he thinks this is a big deal, then he clearly wasn't paying attention. The orcs were created by the Dread God who hates all light. The Dread God wanted an army that would rape and shred its way across the land of Thule. So the orcs aren't just violent for no reason. They are compelled to be violent. It all makes sense if you were paying attention to the backstory.
This comes across as a criticism of the talking heads on YouTube, the ones who use avatars. Yet I'm doing an entire video explaining the problems with these ideologues, their agenda, and the people defending it. Jay Smooth had something to say about her harassment.
So a couple of weeks ago I made a video about how sometimes internet trolls are just sad and annoying, and other times internet trolls are still sad but also genuinely destructive and dangerous. And this week we've had a great example of that second type of trolling with the sexist gamer dude attack on Anita Sarkeesian.
He actually had some common sense things to say in this video, such as this.
If you want to debate Anita Sarkeesian's debates of video game culture, there's plenty of times for that, like for example after she makes the critiques. But none of that stuff is the issue right now. The issue right now is the bullying and abuse and harassment that she's facing.
However, one thing he mentioned was watching the videos on her channel.
Anita does a web video series named Feminist Frequency, which if you watch my stuff, you should already be watching hers.
If we're talking about Feminist Frequency before her Kickstarter, she had that Bayonetta video. That was full of factual inaccuracies. If I was a gamer watching her YouTube channel back then and I saw that video, I would have already been skeptical of her project based on that alone. She later uploaded a recut Bayonetta video the same day she published her Kickstarter video, and the new Bayonetta video is unlisted, meaning you have to dig around for it. So she eventually made some videos. Maybe we can have a conversation, except we can't when people just block me for no reason. Now on my first Twitter account, a bunch of people had me blocked for no reason, but when I started the second account, not so much. I can only speculate why that was the case before, but on my second account, Jonathan McIntosh had me blocked even though I had never tweeted him. He had to go out of his way to block me. He shut down any possibility of a discussion before we even had one. Another person who did this was Arthur Chu. Never tweeted the guy. Going back to Jonathan McIntosh, I've seen several people say how much they respect him, how he does great work. Meanwhile, there's been a slug of people who've been calling him out for several years over his claims about video games. While this is not about video games, he was giving a critique of Mad Max Fury Road on Twitter last year. Some people have had discussions with Jonathan McIntosh over disagreements, but this particular time, he was being a real asshole. He was extremely condescending to anyone who disagreed with him. He was talking down to a lot of people. The next day, someone named Tony Zhu responded to him. I would like a few minutes of your time to respond to these tweets by radical bits that I do not like at all. I care a lot about cinematic film visual literacy. It's the basis for my channel. I wish it were taught in schools, but it mostly isn't. Jonathan McIntosh has crossed two lines I have. His tweet is bad film criticism, and he is being an asshole about it. Tony continued with several more tweets lecturing Jonathan McIntosh. Now who is Tony, you might wonder? He runs a YouTube channel, Every Frame a Painting. I found at least 2 tweets of Jonathan McIntosh complimenting Tony's work. Tony does make some very good videos. I think McIntosh respects Tony. Tony's series of tweets ended with this. If you want the audience to be more visually literate, then the first step is not to look down your nose and lament their lack of ability. I feel that since I've started paying attention to Jonathan McIntosh, that he does a lot of talking down to gamers. So please, don't be an asshole. You're not helping anyone. This is how I felt when I started making my videos. I've always thought a lot of people who criticize Anita are assholes. So I try to take the higher road and not be one. I won't say I didn't act like an asshole over the last year, but I've always tried to maintain some level of decency in my videos. So let's just finish this off with some tweets Feminist Frequency made during E3 about Doom. The stuff they said was difficult to take serious. People have been saying for years that Jonathan McIntosh gives bad video game critique, that Anita Sarkeesian gives bad video game critique, that tropes versus women in video games has problems. Maybe some people think I've been unfair to Feminist Frequency over the last year and a half, but my experience has been they don't want to play fair.